You know, there's something magical about old houses, isn't there? They hold secrets in their walls, memories tucked away in forgotten corners, and sometimes they hold the keys to healing hearts we thought were broken forever. This is the story of Harold Chun, a 70-year-old grandfather living in a modest two-story home in Portland, Oregon, where the rain taps gently on the windows and the memories seem to whisper from every room. Harold had been alone for 8 months now, ever since his beloved wife Margaret passed away after their 47 years of marriage. The house felt too big, too quiet, filled with the echo of conversations that would never happen again and laughter that had been silenced too soon. His children, David, now 45, and Sarah, 42, had come for the funeral, of course. They'd stood there in their black clothes, polite and distant, like strangers paying respects to someone they'd known long ago. The estrangement hadn't happened overnight. No, these things never do. It had been years of small hurts building into big walls, misunderstandings that grew into resentments, and pride that hardened into silence. David lived clear across the country now in Boston, running his own accounting firm, while Sarah had settled in Seattle, close enough to visit but far enough to avoid the complicated emotions that came with family. The grandchildren Harold barely knew sent birthday cards signed by their parents, and Christmas became a season of painful quiet instead of joyful chaos. Margaret had tried, God bless her soul. She'd been the bridge, the one who made the phone calls, sent the birthday cards, and kept the fragile threads of family connection from snapping completely. But even she couldn't fix what had been broken between Harold and his children. The arguments about his drinking in his younger years, the disappointment over career choices, the harsh words spoken in moments of frustration. They all added up like stones in a wall that grew higher each passing year. Now Harold found himself moving through the house like a ghost, touching Margaret's reading glasses still folded on her nightstand, running his fingers over the cookbook she'd marked with little notes in the margins. He'd started the daunting task of going through her things, not because he was ready to let go, but because the silence was becoming unbearable and he needed something, anything, to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. That's when he found himself standing in front of Margaret's old oak desk in what they'd always called the writing room. She'd spent countless hours there, writing in her journal, paying bills, and yes, writing letters. Margaret was old-fashioned that way. She believed in the power of handwritten words on real paper. Email is convenient, she'd always said, but letters carry the weight of the heart. The desk drawer stuck a little from the dampness that crept into old houses, and Harold had to work each one open carefully. The first drawer held the usual things. Pens that didn't work, rubber bands that had lost their stretch, paper clips bent into odd shapes. The second drawer was full of Margaret's correspondence supplies. Boxes of cream-colored stationery, stamps she'd been saving, envelopes of all sizes. But it was the third drawer, the deep one on the bottom right, that stopped Harold's heart. There, tied with faded blue ribbon that he recognized as one Margaret had saved from their wedding bouquet, was a bundle of letters. Not letters she'd received, letters she'd written. The envelopes were addressed in her careful handwriting, some to David Chun, with addresses in Boston, others to Sarah Chin Martinez in Seattle. The postmarks, there were no postmarks. These letters had never been sent. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he untied the ribbon, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light, streaming through the window. There were dozens of them, dating back years. Some were thick, multiple pages heavy with emotion. Others were brief, just a single sheet folded carefully. All of them bore the weight of a mother's love and a wife's quiet desperation to heal her fractured family. He opened the first one, dated just 2 years ago, addressed to David. My dearest David, I know it's been too long since we really talked, and I know your father's stubborn pride matches your own. But sitting here in the quiet of our home, I can't stop thinking about the little boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. Harold's vision blurred with tears he hadn't expected. Margaret had never told him about these letters, never mentioned the hours she must have spent pouring her heart onto paper, trying to find the right words to bridge the gap between the people she loved most. And yet, she'd never sent them. Why? Fear? Hope that face-to-face conversations would happen instead? The crushing weight of knowing that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome years of accumulated hurt? He sat there in Margaret's chair, surrounded by the evidence of her private struggle to heal their family. And for the first time since her funeral, Harold didn't feel quite so alone. Margaret had left him something precious. Not just her love letters to their children, but a roadmap back to the family he thought was lost forever. The autumn rain had turned into a steady drizzle by the time Harold made his decision. He'd spent 3 days reading every single letter Margaret had written but never sent, and each one had been like a gentle hand on his shoulder, guiding him towards something he thought was impossible: hope. These weren't just letters. They were love songs written by a mother who refused to give up on her family, even when silence stretched between them like an ocean. Some of the letters were addressed to David, filled with Margaret's memories of his childhood achievements and her pride in the successful business he'd built. She wrote about missing his laugh, about wanting to know his wife Jennifer better, about longing to be a real grandmother to 8-year-old Emma instead of just a name on birthday cards. "I see so much of your father in you," she'd written in one letter. "The determination, the intelligence, the way you set your jaw when you've made up your mind. But I also see his stubbornness, and, darling, some fights aren't worth winning if they cost you your family." The letters to Sarah were different in tone, but equally heartbreaking. Margaret had written about Sarah's artistic spirit, about the watercolor paintings she created as a teenager that Margaret still had framed in the guest bedroom. She'd written about understanding why Sarah had chosen to live closer, but still maintain her distance, about respecting her daughter's need for space, while desperately missing the closeness they'd once shared. "You were my little shadow once," one letter began, following me around the garden, asking 1,000 questions about why flowers bloom and where the butterflies sleep. "I still have those questions you asked written in my heart, and I wish we could walk through gardens together again." But it was the letters about Harold himself that cut deepest. Margaret had written to both children about their father's struggles with alcohol in his younger years, taking responsibility for enabling his drinking by making excuses and covering for him. She'd explained the pain and fear she'd felt, but also the journey of recovery they'd walked together. "Your father has been sober for 18 years now," she'd written to David, "and every day of those 18 years, he's carried a weight of regret for the father he wasn't when you needed him most. He's never known how to say he's sorry in a way that feels big enough for the hurt he caused." To Sarah, she'd written about Harold's gruff exterior hiding a heart that broke every time he tried to call and couldn't find the words. "He practices conversations with you in the garden," she'd revealed. "I've heard him from the kitchen window, talking to tomato plants about wanting to tell you he's proud of the mother you become, the way you've raised Michael and little Sophia with such patience and love. He just doesn't know how to bridge the gap between wanting to say something and actually saying it." Harold had to put the letters down several times, overwhelmed by the weight of Margaret's insights into his own heart. She'd seen everything: his daily struggles with pride, his midnight worries about his children, his quiet grief over relationships that had withered not from lack of love, but from sheer inability to navigate the complex terrain of forgiveness and reconciliation. She'd understood him better than he'd understood himself. The most recent letters, written just months before Margaret's diagnosis, carried a different urgency. Her handwriting was still steady, but the words revealed her growing awareness that time might be running out. "I'm getting older," she'd written to both children, "and while I hope to have many more years to love you both, I can't shake the feeling that some conversations can't wait forever. Your father loves you more than his pride. But pride is a powerful thing, and sometimes it takes a stronger force to overcome it." She'd been planning, Harold realized. Even as her health began to decline, she'd been strategizing ways to heal their family. One letter outlined a plan for Christmas dinner, with specific seating arrangements and conversation topics, designed to avoid the landmines of past arguments. Another suggested a family vacation, somewhere neutral where they could create new memories instead of rehashing old wounds. She'd even researched family counselors who specialize in adult children and aging parents, carefully writing down names and phone numbers in the margins of a letter she'd never finished. Harold found himself talking to Margaret as he read, whispering responses to her written words as if she were sitting beside him in the gathering twilight. "Why didn't you send them, Maggie?" he asked the empty room. "Why did you carry this burden alone?" But even as he asked, he thought he understood. Margaret had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found diplomatic solutions. Perhaps she'd written these letters as a way of processing her own feelings, working to the complicated emotions of loving people who couldn't seem to love each other properly. Or maybe, Harold thought with a growing sense of purpose, she'd written them knowing that someday he would find them. Maybe these letters weren't meant to be sent by Margaret at all. Maybe they were meant to be delivered by a stubborn old man who'd finally found the courage to admit that being right mattered far less than being connected to the people he loved. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, and Harold looked up from the letters to see his reflection in the darkened window. He looked older than his 70 years, worn down by months of grief and years of regret. But for the first time since Margaret's funeral, he saw something else in his reflection: determination. Margaret had given him a gift more precious than gold, the roadmap back to his children's hearts, written in her own loving hand. Harold reached for his address book, dusty from disuse, and began looking up phone numbers he hadn't dialed in far too long. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin the journey Margaret had mapped out for him. He would take her words of love and carry them across the miles that separated him from David and Sarah. He would deliver the letters Margaret had never sent. And maybe, just maybe, he would discover that love really could overcome the accumulated weight of years of silence and stubborn pride. Harold's hands were steadier than they'd been in months as he dialed David's number the next morning. He'd rehearsed what he would say, had even written down key points on the back of an envelope, but when David's familiar voice answered with a cautious hello, all Harold's prepared words seemed to evaporate like morning mist. "David, it's your father," Harold managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The pause on the other end felt endless. Harold could hear the subtle sounds of David's morning routine. Coffee being poured, probably the rustle of newspapers. Normal sounds from a son's life that had been carrying on without him for years. "Dad." David's voice carried surprise and something that might have been concern. "Is everything okay? Are you sick?" Harold closed his eyes, struck by the immediate assumption that only crisis would prompt this call. When had he become the kind of father his son only expected to hear from in emergencies? "I'm fine, son. Actually, I've been going through your mother's things, and I found something I think you should know about." "Oh." The word was heavy with unspoken emotion. "That must be hard. I should have offered to help. I just thought—" No, David. You don't need to explain anything. I know this hasn't been easy for any of us." Harold looked down at one of Margaret's letters spread open on the kitchen table, her handwriting like a gentle encouragement. "Listen, I found some letters your mother wrote. Letters to you and Sarah that she never sent. And I think maybe it's time they got delivered." The silence stretched again, but this time Harold waited patiently. He'd learned something about patience in these months of grief, that sometimes the most important conversations needed space to breathe. "Letters to me?" David's voice had shifted, become younger somehow. "What kind of letters?" "The kind a mother writes when she misses her son," Harold said simply. "The kind that talk about how proud she was of the man you became, how much you wanted to know Jennifer and Emma better, how she never stopped believing that families can heal if they're willing to try." Harold heard David take a shaky breath. "Dad, we said some harsh things to each other over the years. I don't know if—" "I know, son. Believe me, I know. Your mother wrote about that, too. She wrote about a lot of things, including what a stubborn old fool your father can be." Harold managed a small laugh and was surprised to hear David chuckle in response. "But she also wrote about love being bigger than pride, and about how some conversations are too important to keep putting off." "What are you saying, Dad?" Harold looked out the kitchen window at Margaret's rose garden, where the last blooms of autumn were holding on despite the October chill. "I'm saying I'd like to drive out to Boston and deliver these letters in person. I know it's been a long time since we really talked, but maybe it's time to try again." The conversation that followed wasn't easy, but it was real in a way their interactions hadn't been for years. David shared his own regrets about the distance, his memories of good times that had gotten buried under layers of hurt and misunderstanding. He talked about Emma, how she'd been asking about her grandfather lately, wondering why they never visited Grandpa, who lived far away where it rained all the time. Harold felt his heart crack open a little more with each revelation about the granddaughter he barely knew. She looks like Mom did at that age, David said quietly. Same curious eyes, same way of tilting her head when she's thinking about something important. Jennifer found some old photos of Mom as a child, and the resemblance is incredible. I'd like to see those photos, Harold said, and was surprised by how much he meant it. I'd like to know Emma better. I'd like to know all of you better. By the time they hung up, Harold had an invitation to stay for a long weekend in 2 weeks. David would pick him up at the airport, and Harold would have time to meet properly with Jennifer and Emma, to share Margaret's letters, and to begin the slow work of rebuilding connections that have been neglected for far too long. The call to Sarah proved even more emotional. Sarah had always been the more sensitive of his children, quicker to tears but also quicker to forgive. When Harold explained about finding the letters, Sarah broke down completely. I dreamed about her last night, Sarah sobbed into the phone. I dreamed she was standing in my kitchen, helping me make her apple pie recipe, and when I woke up, I could swear I still smelled cinnamon in the air. Oh, Dad, I miss her so much, and I miss having a family. Harold found himself crying too, something that would have embarrassed him just weeks ago, but now felt like a necessary release. She missed you too, sweetheart. Every day. She wrote about wanting to walk through gardens with you again, about wanting to see your paintings, and hear about Michael's soccer games and Sophia's dance recitals. Sarah lived closer, just a few hours' drive to the Columbia River Gorge, and they arranged for Harold to visit the following weekend. Sarah wanted to cook dinner for him, wanted him to see the house she and her husband Roberto had bought, wanted to show him the art studio she'd finally set up in the basement after years of painting at the kitchen table. The kids don't really remember you, Sarah admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Michael was so young when things got complicated, and Sophia was just a baby. But they know they have a grandpa, and they've been curious. I understand, Harold said, though each word felt like acknowledgement of time that could never be recovered. We'll take it slow, however you think is best. That evening, Harold sat in Margaret's chair with her letters spread around him like pieces of a puzzle he was finally beginning to solve. He'd made the phone calls, taken the first steps toward reconciliation, but he knew the real work lay ahead. These visits wouldn't magically erase years of hurt and distance. There would be awkward moments, difficult conversations, the challenge of getting to know grandchildren who were essentially strangers to him. But Margaret's letters had given him something invaluable, a glimpse into his children's hearts through the eyes of the woman who'd loved them all. She'd written about David's sensitivity hiding behind his business like exterior, about Sarah's strength that looked like fragility to people who didn't know her well. She'd written about the ways Harold's own father had struggled to show affection, and how patterns of emotional distance could echo through generations unless someone was brave enough to break the cycle. I'm going to try, Maggie, Harold whispered to the empty room. I'm going to take your letters and your love, and I'm going to see if this old dog can learn some new tricks. He picked up one of her letters and held it against his chest, feeling closer to her than he had since the day she died. Margaret might be gone, but her love story was still being written, one delivered letter and one healing conversation at a time. The drive to the Columbia River Gorge had never seemed so beautiful or so terrifying. Harold gripped the steering wheel of his old Honda a little tighter as he navigated the winding highway towards Sarah's house in Hood River. Beside him on the passenger seat sat a small wooden box, one of Margaret's jewelry boxes that now held the letters she'd written to Sarah, along with a few photographs Harold had found tucked between the pages. He'd been nervous about this visit all week, practicing conversations in the mirror like a teenager preparing for a first date. What do you say to a daughter you've barely spoken to in 5 years? How do you bridge the gap between the father you were and the grandfather you want to become? Margaret's letters offered guidance, but Harold knew that ultimately he'd have to find his own words. Sarah's house sat on a tree-lined street where maple leaves painted the sidewalks in shades of gold and crimson. It was a modest craftsman-style home with front porch swing and children's bicycles scattered on the lawn. Harold sat in his car for a full minute after turning off the engine, struck by this glimpse into Sarah's life, evidence of the family routines and daily joys he'd missed by staying stubbornly distant. Before he could lose his nerve, the front door opened and Sarah appeared, looking so much like Margaret had at her age that Harold's breath caught. She'd grown her dark hair long, and she wore paint-stained jeans and a soft sweater that made her look both artistic and maternal. Behind her, Harold caught glimpses of two children, a lanky 12-year-old boy and a curious 6-year-old girl with pigtails. "Dad," Sarah said simply, but her voice carried years of complicated emotion. She didn't run to him, didn't hang back either. Instead, she walked steadily down the porch steps and met him halfway across the lawn, where they embraced with the careful tenderness of people learning to trust again. "You look good, sweetheart," Harold said, holding her at arm's length to really look at her. "You look happy." "I am happy," Sarah replied, and Harold could hear the surprise in her own voice, as if she were just discovering this truth. "I mean, I miss Mom terribly, and there's been so much I want to talk to you about, but Roberto and the kids, they're good for me. We're good together." Roberto turned out to be a gentle man with kind eyes and calloused hands who taught high school history and coached soccer on weekends. He greeted Harold with genuine warmth, not the polite distance Harold had expected. Sarah talked about her family all the time. Roberto said as he helped carry Harold's overnight bag inside, "The kids have been asking questions about their grandfather for months." Michael, the 12-year-old, hung back with the wariness of an adolescent who'd heard whispered conversations about complicated family dynamics. But Sophia, the 6-year-old, had no such reservations. She appeared at Harold's elbow while he was admiring Sarah's artwork on the living room walls and announced, "I drew you a picture, Grandpa Harold. Mom showed me photos of you, and I made you with purple hair, because purple is my favorite color." Harold knelt down to Sophia's level, accepting the crayon drawing that depicted a stick figure, with indeed purple hair standing next to what appeared to be a very large cat. "This is beautiful, Sophia. Is that a lion?" "It's Mrs. Whiskers," Sophia explained seriously. "She's Mom's cat from when she was little. Mom said you and Grandma Margaret gave her Mrs. Whiskers for her birthday, and Mrs. Whiskers lived to be super old, like 100. Harold looked up at Sarah, who was watching this interaction with tears in her eyes. "You remember Mrs. Whiskers?" "I remember everything, Dad," Sarah said softly. "The good and the hard parts both. That's what made staying away so complicated. Dinner was a revelation. Roberto had made his grandmother's recipe for pozole, a Mexican soup that filled the kitchen with a warm scent of hominy and chiles. The conversation flowed more naturally than Harold had dared hope, helped along by Sophia's chatter about first grade and Michael's grudging but increasingly animated description of his soccer season. "Grandpa Harold," Sophia said around a mouthful of cornbread, "Mom says you used to build things, like with hammers and stuff." "I did," Harold smiled. "I was a carpenter for 40 years. Built a lot of houses, some furniture, even a tree house for your mom when she was about your age." Michael looked up with interest. "What happened to the tree house?" "It's still there," Harold said, glancing at Sarah. "In the backyard of the house where your mom grew up. It needs some repairs, but the bones are solid. Could we see it sometime?" Michael asked, and Harold felt something loosen in his chest at the casual assumption that there would be future visits, future opportunities to share pieces of his life with these grandchildren. After dinner, while Roberto helped the children with homework and evening routines, Harold and Sarah sat on the front porch swing with Margaret's letters between them. The autumn air was crisp but not cold, and the sound of suburban evening life. Dogs barking, televisions murmuring through windows, the distant laughter of children playing, created a peaceful backdrop for the conversation Harold had been both dreading and longing for. "I should start by apologizing," Harold began, but Sarah shook her head. "Let me read Mom's letters first," she said. "I think maybe they'll help us both understand some things better." Harold watched Sarah's face as she read, seeing emotions flicker across her features like shadows and light. She laughed at some passages, cried at others, and occasionally looked up at Harold with expressions of surprise or recognition. When she finished the last letter, she was quiet for a long time, just holding the pages and looking out at the street where children played hopscotch under the streetlight. "She understood things I didn't even understand about myself," Sarah finally said. "Listen to this. Sarah carries her emotions like watercolors, beautiful and vibrant, but she worries they'll bleed into each other and create a mess. She doesn't realize that the bleeding is part of what makes the art beautiful. Sarah's voice broke slightly. How did she see me so clearly when I felt so confused about everything? Your mother had a gift for seeing people's hearts, Harold said. She saw mine when I couldn't see it myself. She saw yours and David's when you were both trying to protect yourselves from more disappointment. They talked until well past midnight, sharing memories and hurts and hopes for what their relationship could become. Sarah showed Harold her art studio, where she'd been working on a series of paintings inspired by childhood memories. The garden where she'd followed Margaret around asking questions. The kitchen where they'd bake cookies on rainy Saturdays. The living room where the whole family had gathered for Christmas mornings that felt magical despite the undercurrents of tension. I want the kids to have those kinds of memories, Sarah said, standing before a half-finished painting of a family gathered around a Christmas tree. I want them to know what it feels like to be part of something bigger than just our little household. Roberto's family is wonderful, but they're far away in California. I want Michael and Sophia to have grandparents they actually know. I want that too, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to be the grandfather. I never learned how to be a father. Maybe it's not too late to figure out how to do this right. As Harold settled into the guest room that night, Sarah had decorated it with soft quilts and fresh flowers, small touches that spoke of hope for future visits. He felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of joy. Margaret's letters had opened the door, but it was Sarah's willingness to walk through it that made the difference. Tomorrow they would visit Margaret's grave together, something neither had been able to face alone. Then Harold would drive back to Oregon, but not to the isolation he'd left behind. He'd return to a house that felt less empty, carrying the memory of Sophia's purple crayon drawing, and the sound of Sarah's laughter and the knowledge that healing, like love, was something that grew stronger when it was shared. 3 weeks later, Harold found himself standing in Logan Airport in Boston, scanning the crowd for a son he hadn't seen in over 2 years. His palms were sweaty despite the November chill, and he clutched his carry-on bag like a lifeline. Inside that bag were Margaret's letters to David, along with a small photo album Sarah had helped him put together during his visit. Pictures of the family from happier times, mixed with recent photos of her children and Roberto that she'd insisted Harold share with his other son. "Dad!" The voice was tentative, and Harold turned to see David approaching cautiously. He looked older than Harold had expected, more distinguished but also more tired. His dark hair showed threads of gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and heavy responsibilities. But when their eyes met, Harold saw something that made his heart leap. Nervousness that mirrored his own, and underneath it, genuine gladness. "David," Harold said, and then they were embracing with the awkward intensity of men who'd forgotten how to be affectionate with each other. David smelled like expensive cologne and coffee, familiar but foreign at the same time. "How was the flight?" David asked as they walked toward baggage claim, falling into the safe territory of logistics and weather reports. But Harold could see David stealing glances at him, as if he were trying to memorize his father's face or maybe searching for signs of the man he'd once known. "Long," Harold admitted. "I forgot how much I hate flying. Your mother was always the one who handled the travel arrangements when we used to visit you and Sarah." The mention of Margaret created a moment of shared silence, but it was comfortable rather than awkward. They both carried the weight of missing her, and acknowledging that felt like finding common ground. David's house in Cambridge was exactly what Harold had expected. A beautifully restored Victorian with hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, and the kind of carefully curated decor that spoke of success and good taste. But it was also clearly a family home, with Emma's artwork taped to the refrigerator and Jennifer's medical journals stacked on the kitchen counter beside a plate of cookies that looked homemade. Jennifer turned out to be a warm surprise. Harold had met her briefly at the wedding 8 years ago, but he'd been drinking then, and his memories were hazy and tainted by his own discomfort. Sober and genuinely present, he could see why David had fallen in love with her. She was a pediatric nurse practitioner with gentle hands and an easy laugh, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel comfortable. "Mr. Chun," she said, embracing him without reservation. "I'm so glad you're here." David's been nervous as a cat all week, but he's also more excited than I've seen him in a long time. "Please, call me Harold," he said, touched by her warmth. "And thank you for having me. I know this is complicated. Family is always complicated. Jennifer said with a smile, "But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for." Emma was the real revelation. At 8 years old, she was a perfect blend of her parents, David's serious eyes and Jennifer's infectious energy. She'd been shy at first, hiding behind her mother's legs when Harold arrived, but within an hour she would show him her room, her art projects, and her collection of rocks that she'd gathered from various family trips. "Mom says you used to build houses," Emma said as they sat at the kitchen table coloring together while David and Jennifer prepared dinner. "Could you build me a dollhouse?" "Emma," David warned gently from across the room, "Grandpa Harold is visiting. We don't ask visitors to work." But Harold was already studying Emma's current dollhouse, a plastic structure that was clearly mass-produced and already showing signs of wear. "You know what, Emma? I think I like that very much. But it would have to be a special project that we work on together. Would you like that?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? We could build it together? If your parents say it's okay, and if you promise to be very careful with the tools." Harold glanced up to see David and Jennifer exchanging a look that held entire conversations. He recognized the expression. Parents trying to decide whether to allow their child to hope for something that might not happen, weighing the risk of disappointment against the possibility of joy. "We could start with some drawings," Harold suggested. "Figure out exactly what kind of house you want to build. Maybe I could come back in a few months, and we could work on it during spring break." That evening, after Emma had reluctantly gone to bed and Jennifer had tactfully given father and son some privacy, Harold and David sat in the living room with Margaret's letters spread on the coffee table between them. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and outside the windows, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. David read silently, his businessman's composure gradually cracking as Margaret's words reached him across the months since her death. Harold watched his son's face, seeing the boy he'd once been flickering beneath a successful adult mask. When David finished the last letter, he was quiet for a long time, just staring into the fire. "She writes about you being sober," David finally said, his voice carefully neutral. 18 years, she says. 18 years for months and 12 days, Harold confirmed. "I got sober right after your college graduation. You probably don't remember much about that day. I was pretty far gone by the time they called your name." David was quiet, but Harold could see him thinking, perhaps reassessing memories through the lens of this new information. "I remember feeling embarrassed," David said slowly. "I remember wishing you hadn't come at all, because you were not yourself. But I also remember being disappointed that you didn't seem proud of me." Harold felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "Oh, son, I was so proud of you. So proud I could barely contain it. But you're right. The alcohol made it impossible for me to show you that in any way that mattered. Mom writes about you practicing conversations with me in the garden." Harold smiled despite the emotional weight of the moment. "She caught me doing that more times than I can count. I'd be out there talking to the tomatoes, trying to figure out how to call you, and actually have something worthwhile to say. Turns out talking to vegetables is easier than talking to your own son." David laughed, actually laughed, and for a moment he sounded like the boy who used to giggle at Harold's terrible dad jokes. "I practice conversations too," he admitted, "usually in the car during my commute. I imagine calling you and telling you about Emma's school plays or Jennifer's promotion at the hospital. But then I get to the office and the day gets busy and the moment passes." "The moments don't have to pass anymore," Harold said quietly. "We're here now. We're talking now." They stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning, sharing stories and admissions and tentative plans for staying connected. David talked about his business, about the stress of running his own firm, and the satisfaction of helping families plan for their financial futures. Harold shared stories about his carpentry work, about the houses he'd built, and the satisfaction of creating something solid and lasting with his own hands. But more importantly, they talked about the years they'd lost and the years they might still have. David admitted to feeling guilty about living so far away, about allowing pride and old hurts to keep him from bringing Emma to meet her grandfather. Harold admitted to his own guilt about being the kind of father who drove his children away in the first place. "Mom's letters," David said as they were finally getting ready for bed, "they feel like her way of giving us permission to start over." "Maybe that's exactly what they are," Harold replied. Your mother was always wiser than both of us. Maybe she knew that sometimes love needs a translator, and sometimes forgiveness needs a gentle push. As Harold settled into the guest room, Emma had helped Jennifer make up the bed with her favorite blanket, insisting that Grandpa's needed extra comfort. He felt a sense of possibility that he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow, they would visit the children's museum that Emma had been talking about all evening. This weekend, they would start planning the dollhouse project. And in a few months, when Harold came back for that spring break visit, maybe they would have moved beyond the careful politeness of reconnection into something that felt more like family. Margaret's letters had opened the door, but it was going to take time and patience and a willingness to be vulnerable to walk through it completely. Harold was ready for that challenge. At 70 years old, he was finally ready to learn how to be the father and grandfather he'd always meant to become. Spring arrived early in Oregon that year, and Harold found himself spending more time in Margaret's garden than he had since she'd been alive. The daffodils were pushing through the soil with determined optimism, and the cherry tree she'd planted for their 10th anniversary was budding with the promise of blossoms to come. Harold worked among the flower beds with hands that remembered the rhythm of planting and tending, but his mind was occupied with plans that would have seemed impossible just 6 months ago. Emma's dollhouse blueprints were spread across the kitchen table, covered in her careful 8-year-old drawings and Harold's more precise measurements. They'd been corresponding regularly. Emma through dictated emails that Jennifer typed, Harold through handwritten letters that he discovered Emma treasured more than any toy. The dollhouse project had grown from a simple grandfather-granddaughter activity into something that felt like a bridge between past and future. I wanted to look like Great-Grandma Margaret's house, Emma had announced during one of their weekly video calls, with a big kitchen and a garden, and a place where people can sit and talk. Harold had been touched by her instinct that houses should be built for connection, for the conversations that turned buildings into homes. Sarah had become his collaborator in this project, driving over on weekends to help Harold set up his old workshop in the basement. She brought Michael and Sophia, and gradually the house had filled with the sounds that had been missing. Children's laughter, the clatter of footsteps on the stairs, the comfortable chaos of family life. Sophia had appointed herself Harold's special assistant, handing him tools and offering running commentary on his work, while Michael, initially reserved, had begun opening up about school and friends and his dreams of maybe becoming an engineer someday. "Dad, you're different," Sarah had observed one Saturday afternoon as they watched the children play in the backyard. Lighter somehow. More like, I remember you being when I was very small, before things got complicated. Harold had been sanding a piece of wood that would become the dollhouse's front porch, and he'd paused to consider her words. "I think maybe I'm becoming the person your mother always saw in me, even when I couldn't see it myself." Her letters, they weren't just about you and David. They were about helping me understand who I could still become. The breakthrough with David had come during Harold's spring break visit to Boston. Emma had insisted on showing her grandfather her school, introducing him to her teacher and friends with the casual pride that children reserve for people they truly love. Watching his granddaughter navigate her social world with confidence and kindness, Harold had felt a surge of gratitude toward David and Jennifer for raising such a remarkable little person. "She's special," Harold had told David as they sat in the school cafeteria, watching Emma lead a group of classmates in some complicated game that seemed to involve equal parts imagination and negotiation. "She gets that from Jennifer," David had replied, but Harold had shaken his head. "She gets it from all of us. The curiosity from your mother, the determination from you, the creativity from Sarah, even the stubbornness from her old grandfather. That's how families work. We all contribute pieces, and somehow they become something beautiful." It was during that visit that David had finally asked the question Harold had been waiting for. "Dad, what really happened? With the drinking, I've spent years being angry about it, but I realized I never actually understood it." They'd been working together on the dollhouse. Harold had brought the partially completed frame with him, and David had surprised everyone by revealing a hidden talent for detailed work. As they fitted tiny shingles onto miniature roof, Harold had found the courage to tell the story he'd never shared before. "It started after my father died. Harold had begun. You were about 10. Sarah was 7. I'd never dealt with losing him properly," He wasn't an easy man to love, and I had a lot of complicated feelings about our relationship. The drinking made those feelings quieter, at least for a while. Harold had explained about the construction accident that had injured his back, about the prescription painkillers that had mixed dangerously with alcohol, about the spiral dependence that had happened so gradually he hadn't recognized it until it was almost too late. He'd talk about the morning he'd woken up in his truck in the Home Depot parking lot with no memory of how he'd gotten there, about the terrifying realization that he could have killed someone. "Your mother gave me an ultimatum that day," Harold had continued, his hand steady on the tiny wooden pieces despite the emotional weight of the story. "Get help or lose my family." She meant it, and I knew she meant it. That's when I finally understood that the drinking wasn't solving anything. It was stealing everything that mattered to me. David had been quiet for a long time, processing this information while his hands continued the precise work of building something beautiful. "I remember that time," he'd finally said. "I remember Mom crying more and you being absent, even when you were physically there. I remember feeling angry about it, but also scared." "You had every right to be angry," Harold had replied, "and I had no right to put that burden on you and Sarah. Children shouldn't have to worry about whether their father is going to be okay. But you got sober," David had said, "and you stayed sober. One day at a time," Harold had confirmed. "Some days were harder than others, but I never wanted to feel that powerless again. I never wanted to be the kind of man who could hurt his family without even realizing it." That evening, David had shown Harold something precious, a box of mementos he'd kept from his childhood. Among the school papers and sports trophies were things Harold had forgotten about. A wooden toy truck he'd made for David's 6th birthday, a Father's Day card that thanked him for teaching David how to throw a baseball, a photograph of the two of them building a snowman in the backyard. "I kept the good memories, too," David had said quietly. "It wasn't all complicated. There were times when you were exactly the father I needed." Harold had held that photograph for a long time, studying the faces of his younger self and his small son, both grinning at the camera with snow-covered mittens and pure joy. "I want to be that father again," he'd said. "Maybe not exactly the same. I'm older now and hopefully a little wiser. But I want to be present. I want to be someone Emma can count on." "You already are," David had assured him. "She talks about you constantly. She's been showing that dollhouse sketch to everyone who will look at it. You become real to her in a way that, well, in a way you never were for me at her age." The confession had stung, but Harold had recognized the truth in it. He'd been physically present during David and Sarah's childhoods, but emotionally distant, wrapped up in his own struggles and unable to offer consistent love and attention that children need from their fathers. Now, as spring settled into summer in Oregon, Harold was preparing for what felt like the most important visit yet. David and Jennifer were bringing Emma for 2 weeks in July, and Sarah's family would join them for the final weekend. It would be the first time in over a decade that Harold's entire family would be under one roof, and he was both excited and terrified by the prospect. The dollhouse was nearly finished, a perfect miniature Victorian with working doors and windows, tiny furniture that Harold had crafted by hand, and a garden that Emma had designed complete with flowers no bigger than pinheads. But more than just a toy, it had become a symbol of everything they were building together. Patience, attention to detail, love made manifest in small, careful acts of creation. Margaret's rose garden was blooming magnificently, as if she were adding her own blessing to the reunion that was coming. Harold spent his evenings there, sometimes talking to her as he had during their marriage, sharing his hopes and fears about this new chapter in their family story. "I think we're going to be okay, Maggie," he would whisper to the roses. "Your letters, they gave us the map back to each other. But the walking, that's something we had to learn to do ourselves." The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway sent a thrill of nervous excitement through Harold's chest. He'd been up since dawn, making final preparations for what felt like the most important gathering of his life. Emma's dollhouse had completed on the dining room table, every tiny detail perfect, and waiting for her delighted discovery. Sarah's family had arrived the night before, and the house already felt more alive than it had in years, filled with the comfortable chaos of children and grandchildren. Through the front window, Harold watched David emerge from the rental car, stretching after the long drive from Portland International Airport. Jennifer was helping Emma out of the back seat, and Harold's heart clenched at how much his granddaughter had grown in just a few months since his Boston visit. She was taller, more confident, and when she spotted him watching from the window, her face broke into a grin that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "Grandpa Harold!" Emma shrieked, racing up the front walk with her arms outstretched. Harold barely had time to open the door before she launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking him backward with the force of her enthusiasm. "Easy there, tornado," Harold laughed, lifting her up despite his creaking knees. "Let me get a good look at you. I think you've grown 3 inches since spring break." "For inches?" Emma corrected seriously. "Mom measured me against the kitchen door frame, and I lost 2 teeth. See?" She demonstrated the gap in her smile with obvious pride. Behind her, David and Jennifer approached more cautiously, but Harold could see genuine warmth in their faces. The careful politeness of their earlier interactions had evolved into something that felt more natural, though Harold knew they were all still learning the steps of this new family dance. "Dad," David said, embracing Harold with an ease that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "The house looks great. You've been busy." Harold had spent weeks preparing, not just cleaning and organizing, but making the house feel welcoming for children. He bought a step stool for the kitchen sink, stocked a refrigerator with foods Emma and the other grandchildren would enjoy, and even set up a small television in the living room for the first time since Margaret's death. "I had help," Harold admitted, gesturing toward Sarah, who was emerging from the kitchen with flour in her hair and a welcoming smile. The siblings' reunion was tentative but genuine. They hadn't spent extended time together in years, and Harold could see them rediscovering each other as adults, as parents, as people who shared history and DNA and the complex bonds of family. Sophia and Michael hung back initially, uncertain about these relatives they barely remembered, but Emma's natural leadership quickly drew them into her orbit. Within an hour, all 3 children were exploring the house together, Emma giving an enthusiastic tour that included detailed explanations of family photographs and the story behind every piece of furniture that held special memories. "This is Great-Grandma Margaret's piano," Emma announced, running her fingers over the keys with reverence. "Grandpa Harold says she used to play songs for him when they were young and in love." "Can you play?" Michael asked, his 12-year-old skepticism warring with curiosity. "A little," Harold admitted, sitting down on the bench and patting the space beside him for Emma to join. "Your great-grandmother tried to teach me for 47 years. I'm still not very good, but I know a few songs." He played Fur Elise slowly, with more emotion than technical skill, and watched as his grandchildren gathered around the piano with expressions of wonder. When was the last time this old house had heard music? When was the last time children's voices had echoed off these walls? That first evening set the tone for the 2 weeks that followed, the house filled with the rhythms of family life. Morning coffee conversations between the adults while children ate cereal and planned their days. Afternoon projects that involved everyone from 6-year-old Sophia to 7-year-old Harold. Evening gatherings on the front porch where stories were shared and memories were made. Harold discovered that David had inherited Margaret's gift for storytelling, spinning elaborate bedtime tales for all 3 children that left them giggling and begging for more. Sarah contributed her artistic eye, helping the children create a summer scrapbook filled with drawings and pressed flowers from Margaret's garden. Jennifer shared her medical knowledge in ways that fascinated the children, explaining how hearts worked and why bones mended and turning everyday accidents into learning opportunities. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Harold. Emma helping him tend the roses while peppering him with questions about great-grandma Margaret. Michael asking for stories about David as a boy, hungry for details about his father's childhood that somehow made his own relationship with David feel more secure. Sophia falling asleep in Harold's lap during afternoon story time, her small body completely trusting and relaxed. One afternoon, while the children were occupied with elaborate sidewalk chalk mural, Harold found himself alone with David and Sarah on the front porch. The conversation turned, as it often did these days, to Margaret and the letters that brought them all back together. "I've been thinking about something Mom wrote," Sarah said, pulling out one of the letters she'd been carrying with her like a talisman. She wrote about how families are like gardens. They need tending and weeding, and sometimes they need to lie fallow for a while before they can grow again. She was right, David said, watching Emma direct the younger children in their artistic endeavors. We needed that fallow time, as painful as it was. Maybe we all needed to become the people we were meant to be before we could come back together properly. Harold nodded, struck by the wisdom of his son's observation. Your mother always said that love wasn't enough by itself, that it took work and forgiveness and the willingness to keep showing up even when it was hard. She kept showing up for us even when we didn't show up for her, Sarah said softly. These letters, they're proof that she never stopped believing we could find our way back to each other. That evening, Harold made a decision that surprised even himself. After dinner, after the children had been bathed and stories had been read and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet of successful family time, he gathered everyone in the living room. I want to share something with you, Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of significance. Your mother left us something precious in those letters, and I think it's time I share the most important one with all of you. He pulled out a letter that none of them had seen before, one addressed not to David or Sarah individually, but to my beloved family. Margaret had written it during her final weeks, when she knew her time was running short, but her hope for their reunion remained strong. My dearest ones, Harold read aloud, if you are reading this together, then the miracle I prayed for has happened. Harold, my stubborn, loving husband, you found the courage to deliver my words. David and Sarah, my precious children, you found the grace to receive them. And somewhere in that exchange, you found each other again. The letter continued, filled with Margaret's dreams for family gatherings like this one, her hopes for grandchildren who would know their grandfather not as a distant figure, but as a present, loving force in their lives. She wrote about forgiveness being not a single act, but a daily choice, about love being not just a feeling, but a commitment to keep choosing each other despite imperfections and disappointments. I won't be there to see the family dinners and birthday parties and Christmas mornings that I hope will fill the years ahead, Harold continued reading, his voice thick with emotion. But I will be in Emma's laugh when she discovers something wonderful, in Michael's questions when he wants to understand how the world works, in Sophia's trust when she falls asleep feeling safe and loved. I will be in David's determination to be a better father than he thought possible, in Sarah's gift for seeing beauty in ordinary moments, in Harold's newfound courage to love openly instead of guarding his heart. By the time Harold finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Emma had climbed into David's lap, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, even if she didn't fully understand it. Sophia was curled against Sarah, and Michael sat close to his mother, all of them instinctively drawing together in the face of such profound love and loss. She knew, Jennifer whispered, she knew this would happen. She believed in all of you, even when you couldn't believe in each other. Harold folded the letter carefully, adding it to the box where he kept all of Margaret's written gifts to their family. She did more than believe, he said. She gave us the roadmap, but we had to do the walking ourselves. As the family began the slow process of getting ready for bed, children protesting that they weren't tired, adults already planning tomorrow's activities, Harold felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with endings and everything to do with beginnings. Margaret's letters had brought them back together, but it would be their own choices, day after day, that would keep them connected. The last morning of the family visit arrived too soon, bringing with it the bittersweet mixture of gratitude and grief that comes with precious moments that must end. Harold woke early, as had become his habit, and made his way quietly to the kitchen to start the coffee. Through the window, he could see the garden where Margaret's roses were in full bloom, their petals beginning to drop like confetti on the morning breeze. The house was full in a way it hadn't been for years. David and Jennifer in the guest room, Emma on an air mattress in Sarah's old bedroom, which she'd insisted on because it feels like sleeping in Mom's childhood. Sarah's family had claimed the living room with the good-natured adaptability of people accustomed to making anywhere feel like home. The quiet sound of a house full of sleeping family felt like a symphony to Harold's ears. Emma was the first to emerge, padding into the kitchen in her pajamas with her hair sticking up in impossible directions. At 8 years old, she had no capacity for the melancholy that was tugging at Harold's heart. She was pure excitement, bouncing on her toes as she recounted her dreams and made elaborate plans for the pancake breakfast Harold had promised her. Grandpa Harold, she said, climbing onto the counter stool that had become her designated perch. When we come back for Christmas, can we make cookies in Great-Grandma Margaret's kitchen? Mom showed me the recipe box, and there's one for snickerdoodles that has Great-Grandma's handwriting on it. Harold's chest tightened with joy. When we come back for Christmas. Not if, but when. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, these visits had transformed from tentative experiments in reconnection into established family tradition. I think that sounds perfect, Harold said, ruffling Emma's already chaotic hair. We'll make snickerdoodles, and maybe some of her famous sugar cookies, too. The ones shaped like Christmas trees. And stars, Emma added seriously. Stars are very important for Christmas cookies. Absolutely. Stars are essential. The others emerged gradually, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sound of Emma's chatter. The kitchen filled with the comfortable chaos of a family breakfast. Children requesting different types of pancakes, adults negotiating schedules and travel plans, everyone talking over each other in a way that only families can manage without offense. Harold found himself moving through it all with a sense of wonder. 6 months ago, he'd been eating his meals alone, rationing his words because there was no one to share them with. Now his kitchen table was too small to hold everyone, and the conversations flowed around him like a river he thought had run dry years ago. "Dad," Sarah said, catching Harold in a quiet moment while David handled pancake duty, and Jennifer helped Sophia wash syrup off her fingers. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "Mom's writing desk. The one where you found the letters." Sarah's voice carried the particular tone she used when she was working up to saying something important. "I was wondering, would you mind if I used it sometimes? When I come to visit, I'd like to write letters too. Maybe not the kind that never get sent, but real ones. To you, to David, to the kids when they're older." Harold felt his eyes fill with tears he hadn't expected. The idea of Sarah carrying on Margaret's tradition of letter writing, of that old desk, continuing to be a place where love was translated into words, felt like the most natural and healing thing in the world. "I can't think of anything that would make your mother happier," he said, pulling Sarah into a hug that lasted longer than either of them had planned. "She always said that the best way to love people was to pay attention to them, and letters are just attention made permanent. I want Emma and Michael and Sophia to have something to hold on to," Sarah continued, her voice muffled against Harold's shoulder. "When they're older and try to remember what it felt like to be part of this family, I want them to have more than just memories. I want them to have proof that they were treasured." The morning continued with the organized chaos that comes with multiple families trying to coordinate departures. Suitcases were packed and repacked. Last-minute gifts were exchanged. Emma presenting Harold with a drawing of the two of them working on the dollhouse. Michael shyly offering a rock he'd painted with the words "Best Grandpa" in careful block letters. Sophia insisting that Harold keep one of her favorite stuffed animals, so you won't be lonely. Harold tried to memorize every moment. David double-checking flight information while simultaneously helping Emma pack her dollhouse accessories. Jennifer and Roberto comparing notes about the children's sleep schedules. Sarah moving through the rooms of her childhood home with the careful attention of someone committing details to memory. The goodbyes were harder than Harold had expected. Emma clung to him with fierce 8-year-old devotion, making him promise to call every week and to start working on plans for an even bigger dollhouse project. "Maybe a whole town next time," she suggested, her eyes bright with possibility. With a school and a library and a park where families can have picnics. David's farewell was more restrained, but no less meaningful. "Thank you, Dad," he said, simply, for the letters, for the dollhouse, for giving us another chance. "Thank you for taking it," Harold replied. "I know it wasn't easy to trust me again." "It's getting easier," David admitted. "And Emma, she adores you. She's been talking about her Oregon grandpa since the day we got home from spring break. You've given her something I didn't even know she was missing." Sarah's family left last, their departure stretching out with the reluctance of people who didn't want the magic to end. Michael and Sophia had grown comfortable in Harold's house, treating him with a casual affection that children reserve for adults they trust completely. Roberto shook Harold's hand with genuine warmth, thanking him for welcoming him into what he called this beautiful, complicated family. "You raise good kids," Roberto told Harold quietly. It just took them a while to find their way back to showing it. Sarah was the hardest goodbye of all, perhaps because she lived closest and would be the one to check on Harold in the weeks and months ahead. They stood in Margaret's garden surrounded by roses that were just beginning to fade, holding on to each other with the intensity of people who understood how precious and fragile family connections could be. "Don't disappear on us again, Dad," Sarah whispered. "We need you. The kids need their grandfather, and David and I, we need our father." "I'm not going anywhere," Harold promised. "I've got dollhouses to build, and letters to write, and Christmas cookies to learn how to make. I've got grandchildren who need to hear stories about their great-grandmother, and children who still need to know their father loves them." As the last car pulled away from the driveway, Harold stood on his front porch waving until the taillights disappeared around the corner. The house behind him was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than he'd known before. This was the quiet of a house that had been filled with love and would be filled with love again. This was the quiet of a man who was no longer alone. He walked slowly through the rooms, straightening cushions and collecting stray toys that the children had forgotten. In the dining room, Emma's dollhouse stood in its place of honor, every tiny room perfect and complete. But Harold was already thinking about her idea for the dollhouse town, about the winter visits that would give them time to plan and build something even more wonderful. That evening, Harold sat down at Margaret's desk with paper and pen, ready to begin his own tradition of letter writing. He had thank-you notes to write to Jennifer for her patience and warmth, to Roberto for his generous acceptance, to David for his courage in rebuilding their relationship. He had letters to write to his grandchildren, words they could keep and treasure, and read again someday when they were older and perhaps facing their own complicated family situations. But first, he wrote a letter to Margaret herself, though he knew she would never read it. He wrote about the miracle of the past 2 weeks, about watching their grandchildren play in the rooms where David and Sarah had grown up, about the sound of laughter echoing off walls that had been silent for too long. "Your letters worked, Maggie," he wrote, "not just because they gave us permission to try again, but because they reminded us who we could be at our best. The children are wonderful, kind and curious, and so full of life. David had become the kind of father I always hoped he would be, and Sarah's found her strength. They're both better parents than we ever were, and I think maybe that's exactly how it should be." He sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to nowhere and placed it in the box with Margaret's other letters, adding his words to her collection of love made tangible. Tomorrow he would begin the work of staying connected. The phone calls and planning visits and small daily choices that would keep this miracle of family reunion from fading back into memory. But tonight, Harold sat in his quiet house that no longer felt empty, surrounded by the lingering traces of the family he thought was lost forever. Margaret's roses bloomed outside his window, and somewhere in Boston and Seattle, his children were tucking his grandchildren into bed with stories about their Oregon grandfather who built dollhouses and wrote letters and had learned. Finally, that love was not just something you felt, but something you chose to do, over and over again, one day at a time. Christmas Eve found Harold standing at his kitchen counter, flour dusting his hands and Margaret's handwritten recipe card propped against a canister of sugar. The snickerdoodles were already cooling on racks throughout the kitchen, filling the house with a warm sense of cinnamon and vanilla. Star-shaped sugar cookies waited their turn in the oven, and Emma's voice carried from the dining room, where she was providing detailed direction to her cousins about the proper arrangement of furniture in the ever-expanding dollhouse town. The past 6 months had transformed not just Harold's house, but his entire life. What had started as tentative visits had evolved into a natural rhythm of family connection. David called every Sunday evening, sharing stories about Emma's school activities and his own gradual discovery that being a father was easier when you had your own father as a sounding board. Sarah drove over most weekends, often bringing Michael and Sophia, sometimes coming alone when she needed the quiet of her child at home and her father's patient ear. The dollhouse project had grown beyond anything Harold could have imagined. What had started as a single Victorian house now encompassed an entire miniature community, a school that looked remarkably like Emma's in Boston, a library where tiny figures could sit and read impossibly small books, a park complete with benches and walking paths. Each building represented hours of collaboration between Harold and his grandchildren, their relationships deepening with every carefully crafted detail. But it was the letters that had become Harold's greatest source of joy. Following Sarah's example, He'd begun writing regularly to each of his grandchildren. Real letters that went through the postal service, arriving in mailboxes like small gifts. Emma saved every one, reading them aloud to her parents and keeping them in a special box decorated with drawings of flowers and houses. Michael, initially skeptical of written communication, had begun writing back, sharing stories about soccer and school that revealed depths of personality Harold never could have discovered through brief phone calls. Even Sophia, too young to read the letters independently, had claimed them as treasures, asking Sarah to read them over and over until she had memorized Harold's expressions of love and pride. The little girl had begun drawing pictures specifically to send to Grandpa Harold in Oregon, creating an ongoing correspondence of hearts and rainbows and stick figures that Harold displayed prominently on his refrigerator. Grandpa Harold, Emma called from the dining room, "I think the library needs more books. The tiny people are getting bored." "We'll work on that tomorrow," Harold called back, smiling at the seriousness with which his granddaughter approached the intellectual needs of imaginary library patrons. "Right now we need to focus on getting these cookies ready for Santa." The family had been arriving throughout the day. David and Jennifer had flown in that morning, Emma immediately claiming her status as chief cookie decorator and demanding a full inspection of the latest additions to the dollhouse town. Sarah's family had arrived the night before, and the house had quickly filled with the comfortable chaos that Harold had learned to treasure. Jennifer had proven to be an unexpected gift in all of this. Her gentle warmth had helped bridge the gaps between generations, and her medical background had eased Harold's worries about being responsible for active grandchildren. More importantly, she had encouraged David's gradual opening up about his childhood, helping him separate the painful memories from the good ones and find ways to share both with Emma. "You know," Jennifer had told Harold during one of their quiet kitchen conversations, "David talks about you all the time now. He tells Emma stories about learning to build things with his grandfather, about the treehouse you made for Sarah, about the way you could fix anything that broke. He's remembering things he thought he'd forgotten." Roberto, too, had become more than just Sarah's husband. He understood complicated family dynamics from his own experience, and his patient way of including Harold in conversations about the children's activities had helped Harold feel like a real grandfather rather than an occasional visitor. When Michael had expressed interest in learning Spanish, it was Roberto who had suggested that Harold join the lessons, creating a 3-generation learning experience that had become one of their favorite weekend activities. But perhaps the most profound change had been in Harold himself. The careful isolation he'd built around his grief had gradually dissolved, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection that made each day feel meaningful. He'd begun volunteering at the local senior center, teaching basic woodworking skills to other widowers who were struggling with loneliness. The work reminded him daily that healing was possible at any age, that it was never too late to choose connection over isolation. "Dad," Sarah said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with pain in her hair and satisfaction in her smile, "the mural is finished. Want to come see?" Harold wiped his hands on his apron and followed Sarah to the guest bedroom, where she'd been working for weeks on a surprise for the children. The wall now displayed a beautiful watercolor scene of a family gathering. Children playing in a garden while adults sat on a porch, everyone's face glowing with contentment. It wasn't a literal representation of any specific moment, but rather an emotional landscape of what family could be at its best. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would have loved it." "I painted it for her as much as for us," Sarah admitted. "I wanted her to be part of this somehow. She's in all our faces, in the way Emma tilts her head when she's thinking, in David's smile when he's really happy, in your hands when you're building something with love." That evening, after the cookies had been decorated and the stockings had been hung with exaggerated ceremony, Harold found himself surrounded by the family he'd thought was lost forever. Emma was curled against his side on the sofa, reading aloud from A Christmas Story while the other children listened with the patient tolerance that older cousins showed their enthusiastic younger relatives. David and Jennifer sat together on the floor, David absently building block towers for Sophia to knock down. Sarah and Roberto occupied the chairs by the fireplace, their quiet conversation punctuated by comfortable silences. It was Margaret who was missing, and Harold felt her absence like a gentle ache in his chest. But he also felt her presence in the love that filled the room, in the laughter that echoed off the walls, in the simple miracle of family choosing to show up for each other despite past hurts and present complications. "Grandpa Harold," Emma said, looking up from her book with the serious expression she wore when asking important questions, "do you think Great-Grandma Margaret can see us now?" Harold considered the question carefully, aware that all the adults in the room were listening for his answer. "I think love doesn't disappear just because someone dies," he said finally. "I think the love your great-grandmother had for all of us is still here in this room, in the way we take care of each other, and the way we choose to forgive each other, and the way we keep making space for new people to join our family." Emma nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the wisdom that children sometimes possess about matters that confound adults. "I think she would like the dollhouse town," she said, "especially the park where families can have picnics." "I think you're absolutely right," Harold agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Later, after the children had been tucked into beds and air mattresses throughout the house, Harold sat alone in Margaret's writing room with pen and paper. The Christmas Eve tradition of letter writing had become sacred to him, a way of capturing the gratitude and wonder he felt at being given this unexpected second chance at family. He wrote to Margaret first, as he always did, telling her about the day's small miracles and large graces. He wrote about Emma's determination to make the perfect star-shaped cookie, about Michael's shy pride and his improving Spanish pronunciation, about Sophia's artistic interpretation of Christmas trees that looked more like green tornadoes. He wrote about David's laughter and Sarah's creative vision, and the way Jennifer and Roberto had become not just additions to their family, but essential pieces of what made them whole. Then he wrote letters to each of his children and grandchildren, words they would find under the tree the next morning alongside their other gifts. To David, he wrote about pride and forgiveness and the daily miracle of watching him be the father Harold had always hoped he would become. To Sarah, he wrote about creativity and resilience and the way she had turned her own struggles into strength that could lift others. To Emma, Michael, and Sophia, he wrote about love being like the dollhouse town they were building together, something that grew stronger and more beautiful with each careful addition. But the most important letter was the one he wrote to himself, a practice he'd begun on Margaret's birthday earlier that year. In it, he acknowledged the man he had been, flawed and struggling and often unable to show love in the ways his family needed. But he also celebrated the man he was becoming, present and engaged and finally willing to do the work that real love required. "I'm 71 years old," he wrote, "and I'm just learning that being a father and grandfather isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about showing up again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." As Christmas morning dawned over Oregon, Harold woke to the sound of children's voices and running feet, the house alive with excitement and anticipation. Emma was the first to find him, bouncing on his bed with the irrepressible energy of Christmas morning. "Grandpa Harold, Santa came, and there are presents everywhere. And Mom made coffee and Dad is making pancakes, and Sophia is trying to open everything even if it's not hers." Harold laughed, pulling on his robe and following Emma's chattering excitement down the stairs. The living room was indeed filled with presents, but more importantly, it was filled with his family, his children and their spouses and his grandchildren, all gathered in the house where love had once seemed impossible and now felt as natural as breathing. The morning unfolded with the beautiful chaos of Christmas, wrapping paper flying, exclamations of delight over gifts both expected and surprising. Children play with boxes as much as the toys that came in them. Harold watched it all with the wonder of someone who had never expected to experience this kind of joy again. But the moment that would stay with him forever came late in the morning, when the frenzy of present opening had settled into a quieter contentment. Emma had found the dollhouse town under the tree. Harold had added a tiny church complete with stained glass windows made from colored cellophane, and she was showing to Michael and Sophia with tour guide enthusiasm. "This is where the families live," she explained, moving tiny figures around the miniature streets. "And this is where they go to learn things. And this is where they go to feel peaceful. But the most important part is the park, because that's where they all come together." Harold caught David's eye across the room and saw his own emotion reflected there. This 8-year-old girl had understood something profound about family and community, something that had taken Harold 7 decades to learn. That love wasn't just about the individual houses where we lived our separate lives, but about the shared spaces where we chose to come together. Emma, Harold said, kneeling down beside his granddaughter and her miniature world. "Would you like to help me build something new for the town?" "What kind of something?" she asked, her eyes bright with possibility. "A bridge," Harold said, the idea forming as he spoke. "Something that connects all the different parts of the town, so the families can visit each other more easily." Emma's face lit up with understanding and excitement. "Yes, a bridge. Because families need to be able to reach each other, right?" "Right," Harold agreed, his voice thick with the weight of metaphor and memory. Families always need bridges back to each other. As the day continued with its gentle rhythm of family time, walks in the winter garden, stories by the fireplace, a Christmas dinner that filled Margaret's dining room table to capacity, Harold felt a deep sense of completion. Not the completion of ending, but the completion of wholeness. Margaret's letters had given them the map back to each other, but they had built the bridges themselves, board by board, conversation by conversation, choice by careful choice. That evening, as the house settled into the peaceful exhaustion that follows perfect days, Harold stood in Margaret's garden under the winter stars. The roses were dormant now, but he could feel their life sleeping under the soil, waiting for spring's return. Beside him stood David and Sarah, his children who had become his friends, his partners in the ongoing work of being a family. "Thank you, Dad," Sarah said quietly, her breath visible in the cold air, "for fighting for us, for not giving up when it would have been easier to stay lost." "Thank you for letting me find you," Harold replied, pulling his children close on either side. "Thank you for letting me learn how to love you better." They stood together in the quiet of Christmas night, 3 generations of healing made visible under the vast Oregon sky. In the house behind them, Harold's grandchildren slept surrounded by gifts and love and the security of knowing they belonged to something larger than themselves. Margaret's letters had started this journey, but it would be their own daily choices that would continue it. Phone calls and visits and the small act of attention that prove love is not just a feeling, but a decision made new each day. Harold Chung was 71 years old, and he was finally completely home. The morning light was different somehow as Harold sat at Margaret's desk 1 year later, but he couldn't quite name what had changed. The garden outside showed the fresh green of another Oregon spring, and the house held the comfortable quiet of a man who was no longer alone, even when no one else was physically present. The phone would ring soon with David's weekly call from Boston, and Sarah would arrive this afternoon with paint samples for her latest mural project. But for now, Harold enjoyed the peaceful solitude that had transformed from loneliness into contentment. Before him lay a letter that had arrived yesterday, the careful handwriting unmistakably Emma's, despite her 9-year-old eagerness that made some letters lean sideways and others stretch tall. She was writing more frequently now, their correspondence having evolved into a genuine friendship that spanned generations and geography. This particular letter had made Harold laugh out loud, then sit quietly with gratitude for the miracle of being known and loved by this remarkable child. "Dear Grandpa Harold," Emma had written, "I have been thinking about Great-Grandma Margaret's letters and how they brought our family back together. My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, asked us to write about heroes, and I wrote about you and Great-Grandma Margaret because you both did something brave. She was brave to write about love even when she couldn't say it out loud, and you were brave to deliver the letters even when you were scared. Mrs. Patterson said that's the best kind of hero, the kind who does important things even when they're frightened. I want to be that kind of hero, too." Harold had to pause in his reading, overwhelmed by the depth of understanding in those words. Emma grasped something that had taken him a lifetime to learn. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but a decision to act with love despite the fear. Margaret had been frightened when she wrote those letters, afraid that her words wouldn't be enough to bridge the gaps that had widened over years of silence and hurt. Harold had been terrified when he'd picked up the phone to call David that first time, uncertain whether his son would even want to hear from him. But they had both chosen love over safety, connection over comfort, and that choice had created space for healing that neither of them could have imagined alone. The letter continued with Emma's news about school and friends, about the dollhouse town that now occupied an entire corner of her bedroom and had become a neighborhood attraction. Other children came to play with Emma's miniature world. Drawn by stories of the grandfather who built impossible tiny furniture and the great-grandmother whose love letters had magical powers. Emma, Harold realized with pride, was becoming a storyteller like her father, weaving family history into narratives that made love seem both ordinary and extraordinary. I am also writing to tell you, Emma's letter continued, that Mom and Dad said we might move to Portland next year. Dad's company wants him to open an office there, and Mom says it would be nice to be closer to family. I told them that was the best idea they ever had, even better than the time Dad suggested we get ice cream for breakfast on my birthday. If we moved to Portland, I could see you every weekend. We could work on the dollhouse town every Saturday, and maybe you could teach me to build real things too, like birdhouses or a garden shed for great-grandma Margaret's roses. Harold set the letter down with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the overwhelming possibility of having Emma so close, of being part of her daily life rather than a beloved but distant figure. David had mentioned the promotion opportunity during their last call, but Harold hadn't dared to hope it would actually happen. Now, reading Emma's excitement translated into her careful 9-year-old handwriting, he felt a joy so complete it made his chest ache. The phone rang right on schedule, and Harold smiled as he recognized the rhythm of David's Sunday call. These conversations had become one of the pillars of Harold's week, a chance to share the small details of daily life that gradually built understanding and connection. Morning, Dad. David's voice carried the warmth that had replaced the careful politeness of their early reconnection. How's the weather in Oregon? Emma's been obsessing over the possibility of snow in her new hypothetical backyard. Tell her she'll get snow, Harold laughed. But probably not until December, and even then it might not stick. Oregon snow is more promise than delivery most years. But David, is it real? The Portland office. It's looking very real, David confirmed, and Harold could hear the smile in his voice. Jennifer's already researching pediatric practices in the area, and Emma has started planning her room in our hypothetical new house. She wants it to face east so she can wave good morning to her grandfather. They talked for nearly an hour, mapping out possibilities and practical considerations. David would need to find the right house, in the right school district, with space for Jennifer's home office and Emma's growing dollhouse empire. Harold found himself making mental lists of things he could help with, his knowledge of local contractors, his connections in the woodworking community, his eagerness to be useful in any way that would bring his family closer. Dad, David said as their conversation was winding down, I want you to know that this decision, it's not just about the job. It's about Emma growing up knowing her grandfather, about Jennifer and me having your support, about being part of something bigger than just our little nuclear family. Mom's letters showed us what we were missing, but this past year has shown us what we could have. After they hung up, Harold sat in the quiet of his kitchen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of change that was unfolding. Emma living nearby, weekend projects that wouldn't require careful coordination and airline schedules, the possibility of being present for school plays and soccer games, and the ordinary moments that built relationships day by day. Sarah arrived that afternoon as promised, but instead of paint samples, she brought news that made Harold's remarkable day even more extraordinary. Dad, she said, settling into the chair across from him at the kitchen table, Roberto got offered a position at Portland State, teaching history and coordinating their new community outreach program. We'd be moving too. Not as close as David and Jennifer, but close enough for regular family dinners and shared holidays. Harold stared at his daughter, trying to process the idea that both of his children were considering moves that would bring them back to Oregon, back to the place where they'd grown up and where Margaret was buried, and where Harold had learned, finally, how to be the father he'd always meant to be. What about your art, your studio? Harold asked, knowing how hard Sarah had worked to establish herself in the Seattle art community. Portland has a wonderful art scene, Sarah replied, her eyes bright with possibility. And honestly, Dad, some of my best work this past year has been inspired by being here, by reconnecting with family, by watching the kids discover their heritage. I think I could create anywhere now, as long as I'm surrounded by the people I love. That evening, Harold called Margaret's sister Ruth in California, needing to share this incredible news with someone who would understand its full significance. Ruth was 83 and had been Margaret's closest confidant throughout their marriage. She'd watched from a distance as Harold's family had fallen apart, and she'd been one of the first people Harold had called when Margaret's letters began their work of healing. Ruth! Harold said when she answered the phone. "I think Margaret is still orchestrating miracles from wherever she is now." He told her about David's promotion and Sarah's opportunity, about the possibility of having his entire family within a few hours' drive for the first time in over a decade. Ruth listened with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told completely, without interruption. "Harold," Ruth said when he finished, her voice thick with emotion, "Margaret always believed that families were like rivers. They might get diverted by obstacles or drought, but they always find their way back to where they belong. She used to tell me that you and the children would find each other again, that love like yours doesn't just disappear." "I miss her," Harold said simply. "I wish she could see this, could be part of it." "Oh, Harold," Ruth replied gently, "she is part of it. Every choice you made to stay connected, every letter you've written, every moment you've chosen love over pride, that's Margaret's influence made visible. Those letters didn't just bring your family back together. They taught you how to keep them together." That night, Harold sat in Margaret's writing room with paper and pen, but for the first time in months, he struggled to find words adequate for his gratitude. How do you capture the miracle of second chances? How do you express the overwhelming joy of watching love multiply rather than diminish when it's shared? Finally, he began to write, not to Margaret this time, but to his future self, the man he would be when Emma lived close enough to visit after school, when David's business trips would end with family dinners rather than lonely hotel rooms, when Sarah's children would grow up knowing their grandfather as more than a distant figure in old photographs. "Dear future Harold," he wrote, "remember this moment. Remember the overwhelming gratitude that comes with unexpected grace. Remember that it's never too late to learn how to love better, how to choose connection over comfort, how to build bridges instead of walls. Margaret's letters brought us back together, but it will be our daily choices that keep us close. Choose wisely. Choose love. Choose to show up again and again for the people who matter most." As spring settled into summer in Oregon, Harold began preparing his house and his heart for the changes that were coming. He cleaned out closets to make room for visiting grandchildren, researched schools and neighborhoods where his children might want to live, and started planning projects that would require multiple hands and many afternoons of shared work. But mostly, he simply lived each day with a profound gratitude of a man who had been given a second chance at family, who had learned that love was not just something you felt, but something you practiced, who had discovered that it was never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. Margaret's letters had started this journey, but Harold Chin was writing its continuation. One phone call, one visit, one carefully chosen act of love at a time. The story was far from over, but Harold finally understood that the best stories never really end. They just keep growing, gathering new characters and deeper meanings, creating space for love to expand in ways that surprise and sustain everyone lucky enough to be part of the tale. At 72 years old, surrounded by the evidence of love returned and multiplied, Harold Chin was home in every sense that mattered. And Margaret's roses bloomed outside his window, as faithful as love itself, returning each spring with a promise that beautiful things could grow from even the most barren ground.